I never should have taken this assignment. That's what I keep telling myself as I sit here, huddled in the dark, trying to make sense of everything that's happened. But I guess I should start at the beginning. My name's Jane. I'm a journalist. Or at least, I was. Now, I'm not so sure what I am. It all started with a phone call from my editor, Mike. "Jane," he said, "I've got a story for you. Big one. Could make your career." I perked up at that. I'd been stuck doing fluff pieces for months. Human interest stuff. Nice, but not exactly Pulitzer material. "What's the scoop?" I asked. "Old Asylum just outside of town," Mike said. "Closed down in the 50s. There's talk of tearing it down, but some historical society types are making noise about preserving it. I want you to go check it out. Dig up some history. Maybe find an angle." Sounded simple enough. Little did I know. I drove out there the next day. Place was a mess. All boarded up windows and peeling paint. Looked like something out of a horror movie. But hey, I'm a professional, right? I wasn't gonna let a creepy old building scare me off. I picked the lock on a side door. Yeah, I know. Not exactly legal, but sometimes you gotta bend the rules a little to get the story. Besides, place was abandoned. Who was I hurting? Inside, it was like stepping back in time. Old metal beds with rusted springs, wheelchairs covered in cobwebs, and the smell, like mold and decay and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I started in what looked like an admin area. Figured I might find some old records or something. And boy, did I ever. Hidden in the back of an old filing cabinet, I found a stack of folders. Patient files, but not like any I'd ever seen. These were different. Detailed notes on treatments that made my skin crawl. Electroshock therapy cranked up to dangerous levels. Experimental drugs with side effects that, well, let's just say they weren't FDA approved. And all of it signed off by one man, Dr. Victor Reinhardt, head of the asylum. I was so engrossed in reading, I didn't notice how dark it had gotten. When I finally looked up, the shadows seemed to move. Just tricks of the light, I told myself. But then I heard it. A whisper, right behind me. "Help us," it said. I spun around, heart pounding. But there was nothing there. Just empty air and dust motes. That should have been my cue to leave. To get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't. The story was too big. Too important. These people, these patients, they'd suffered. Their stories deserved to be told. So I kept digging. Kept reading. The more I uncovered, the worse it got. Dr. Reinhardt wasn't just cruel, he was methodical. He'd pick patients with no family, no connections, people no one would miss, and then he'd experiment on them, trying to, in his words, push the boundaries of the human mind. I don't know how long I was there, poring over those files, but suddenly, I realized something. The whispers I'd been hearing, they weren't just in my head. They were all around me. "Tell our story," they said. "Make them remember." I looked up, and that's when I saw them. Shadows, but more than shadows. Shapes. People. Patients in old hospital gowns, their eyes sunken, their skin pale. They were all around me, watching, waiting. I screamed, dropped everything and ran. Didn't stop until I was in my car, tearing down the road back to town. I thought that was the end of it, that I just had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But then the dreams started. Every night, the same thing. I'd be back in that asylum, but this time, I was the patient, strapped to a bed, helpless, as Dr. Reinhardt loomed over me with his instruments. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. And it wasn't just at night. During the day, I'd see things, glimpses of those patients, just out of the corner of my eye. I'd hear whispers when no one was around. "Help us," they'd say. "Tell our story." I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on writing the article. But the more I wrote, the more intense it got. The visions, the whispers, they were taking over my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My editor was getting worried. "Jane," he said, "maybe you should take a break. This story's getting to you." But I couldn't stop. I had to finish it, had to tell their story. that's when things got really weird. I started experiencing what the patients had gone through, not just in dreams, but in real life. I'd be walking down the street and suddenly feel electricity coursing through my body, just like the electroshock therapy. Or I'd be hit with waves of nausea and disorientation, like I was on those experimental drugs. It was like the patients were sharing their experiences with me, making me feel what they'd felt. And through it all, the whispers continued. Tell our story. Make them remember. I finished the article, sent it to my editor. It was the best thing I'd ever written. Raw, powerful, the truth laid bare for all to see. Mike called me an hour later. "Jane," he said, his voice shaking. I don't know what to say. It's incredible, but are you sure about this? These allegations, they're serious. We could be looking at lawsuits." "It's all true," I said. "Every word. I have the files to prove it." There was a long pause. Then Mike said, "Okay, we'll run it. Front page." I should have felt relieved, triumphant, but all I felt was dread, because I knew it wasn't over. That night, the dreams were worse than ever. But this time, it wasn't just me in that hospital bed. It was all of them, all the patients. And they were looking at me, their eyes full of pain and hope. "You did it," they said. "You told our story. Now we can rest." I woke up crying, but for the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful. The whispers were gone. The visions had stopped. It was over. The article ran the next day. It was like a bomb went off. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the asylum, about Dr. Reinhardt and his experiments. There were calls for investigations, for justice, even after all these years. I should have been happy. This was the big break I'd always wanted. But all I could think about were those patients. Those poor, tortured souls who'd been forgotten for so long. I went back to the asylum one last time. Don't ask me why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe part of me was still drawn there. The place was different now. Quiet, peaceful. As I stood there, looking up at those broken windows and crumbling walls, I felt it. A presence. But not scary this time. Comforting. "Thank you," a voice whispered on the wind, and then it was gone. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, in spirits, or the supernatural, but I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. And I know that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Sometimes it reaches out to us, demanding to be heard. The asylum's been turned into a memorial now, a place to remember those who suffered there, to make sure nothing like that ever happens again. And me? Well, I'm still a journalist, still telling stories, but I'm different now, changed, because now I know that every story has a voice. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough, we can hear the whispers of those who can no longer speak for themselves. It's our job to listen, to hear, and to make sure their stories are told. So that's my story. Believe it or don't. But next time you pass an old, abandoned building, just remember, the walls have memories. And sometimes, those memories are desperate to be heard.